So we wanted to have just a quick informal discussion with regards to kind of a bit of a review of all of the amazing things that happened in 2016. It's been quite a year politically, and we thought we would just kind of mull over a few of the things, see what our opinions are, and talk over many of the kind of the main talking points that have come out of 2016. And I thought the best topic to start on, being seeing as it's actually the day after the inauguration of Donald Trump, would be the completely amazing and completely improbable victory of Donald Trump in becoming the 45th President of the United States of America. So what immediately kind of comes to mind? What's the first thing that you think about when that particular topic comes up round the dinner table, or when you're kind of discussing with friends? What's the first kind of point of contact, the first touchstone when that kind of incredible kind of phenomena?
Yeah, I kind of think almost it's like supporting Donald Trump is almost the new punk. It's kind of because it's a reaction to kind of moral outrage. It used to be the thing is to dye your hair black and have piercings and everything, but those people now are like they're on Newsnight and they're the most moral, often kind of vegan and most easily offended people. So I think people who used to maybe a couple of generations ago would have inhabited that space. Now it's kind of going online and sharing memes with Donald Trump and supporting him and just seeing where he goes. And I think on a more serious note, the fact that he's said so many outrageous things and done so many things that would disqualify anybody else, and the fact that his supporters almost his support seems to grow with that almost, is like saying, you see this guy over there, look at what he's done, what he's said, all these silly, crazy things. I still think that's better than you guys in Washington.
Yeah.
I'd rather, even Donald Trump, even the guy with the strange hair who says strange things, I'd rather have him than someone who's just tied to big money and who's going to pursue policies that aren't in our interest.
Well, it's quite funny that you mentioned or kind of draw the analogy with punk rock. In that I remember listening to the historian Neil Ferguson once talking about punk Toryism in the 1980s, as kind of compared to Baroque socialism. So it's something that's not completely original in that sense. It's got kind of seeds in the past, or things have kind of foreshadowed this kind of idea of not outrage previously, but a real kind of reaction to kind of saying enough's enough. And I think that's kind of there was an essence of that in the Thatcher Revolution and in the Reagan Revolution as well, that just clearly wasn't as populist and as kind of extreme as we're seeing now. I think a great place to start as well with Donald Trump is with regards to something that obviously has not escaped the media coverage in this country. Certainly something that's taken up about 99% of the coverage of Donald Trump has been actually about his personality, rather than anything any more substantial about policy or anything like that. So what kind of, Johan, what's your immediate take on kind of the absolute fascination, obsession with the personality of Donald Trump?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is the way the left approaches this, because if you look, there's the film Clinton Cash, which I think is a really good breakdown of the actual actions of the Clintons, and not just that, her foreign policy in Libya. These are two things which are actions. We're putting those actions against things that Donald Trump has said and trying to say that these words are worse than these horrific actions. And that's a sort of the factor that the left seem to be mixing up is actions are
but words
genuinely
are violence.
Well, no,
I know exactly.
Think so.
Yeah,
I don't think so. And you can't just say
being
because
sarcastic, by the way.
Just because he said some horrendous things that are some of the things are pretty horrendous, but you can't conflate that with some of the actions. And this actually brings me to another thing that I felt in the run up. I heard Bill Maher, the American comedian, and he said something absolutely brilliant. He said, we lied to you about who are the two guys, two guys who ran against Obama. It was McCain and
Mitt Romney.
Romney.
Yeah.
That was it. He said, "We lied to you about Romney. He wasn't sexist. He wasn't a racist bigot.
Yeah,
We
true.
lied to you about McCain, but this time it's real, and
It's
this,
crying wolf.
Cry wolf, exactly.
Exactly, and it's very dangerous. The crying wolf that has been going on so much in the last couple of years to do with racism and sexism and everything. It's got so strong that it's really made it provided a cloak of invisibility for people who really are like that. And you even have people on the right who are kind of making excuses for Richard Spencer, who was the guy that was caught on tape doing Nazi salutes and everything, and he even writes Heil Hitler in code, but well-known code, at the end of his tweets, and he's come out and claimed he only does that as a joke, and some people are even starting to believe that. Like, it's just got to such a really point where those words have lost their impact and their meaning, which is a great shame, because it has kind of left the door open for actual dangerous people.
What I think 2 points that are really pertinent on this particular subject is, I forget which journalist said it, however they encapsulate the essence of Donald Trump and his persona, is that the American people, when they listened to Donald Trump, took what he said seriously but not literally, but the establishment and the media seem to take him literally but not seriously. And I think that kind of links in with his personality as well, because, and I like to think of this historically and kind of use a few, it's quite unpopular to think historically these days, there seems to be kind of a willing amnesia and a willing kind of prohibition about actually making any historical comparisons with Donald Trump, apart from if it's historical.
He's Hitler.
Literally
Hitler.
Apart from
the 1930s.
comparisons with Adolf Hitler and National Socialism in the 1930s. If, for example, we're to look at the array of quite despicable things that past US presidents have done to women ever since we look back in the 1960s with JFK and his less than kind of upright and moral interaction with kind of all the romances that he pursued in the White House, kind of a serial kind of womanizer. Obviously wonderful kind of, say, 1960s family values. If you read Paul Johnson's History of the United States of America, he talks about how Lyndon Johnson was a serial groper in the White House of Women. And we've obviously got the example in the 1990s with Bill Clinton having sex with White House staffers. With I think Monica Lewinsky was actually an intern when he cornered in the Oval Office. Even and I know Richard Nixon's not necessarily seen as an innocent or angelic figure. However, quite a few of the deeply anti-Semitic and racist things that Nixon said in the White House that were caught on tape. Again, what seems to be amazing is most of this is forgotten, and Donald Trump's seen as a unique character, but what's important about this is that you don't necessarily see much evidence or kind of people putting two and two together as far as how that's actually, as despicable as it is, how's that actually going to affect policy and practice? Did having such a low opinion of women affect the way Bill Clinton, JFK or Lyndon Johnson operated in the White House, or because they're all Democrats, does that mean that they kind of get a
free pass,
kind of get out of jail free card on that?
Yeah, I mean, how many Democrats are outraged? Even their opinion really isn't even affected of JFK. He's still seen as an angel, even though he had all these. He used to literally go to parties with Jackie O, and she would have to go home on her own because he would leave, and she would have to find a lift home. Literally, it was just absolutely horrendous. And the things that he said to the Prime Minister at the time on the phone is basically just as bad as the hot mic interview. I mean, what also was funny was how people who support his policies, who are clearly very conservative, try to say it was nothing as well. So it goes both ways. But I was seeing Ben Carson, who's a very conservative, kind of evangelical guy, and I imagine where he lives and everything, most people he surrounds himself are, but he was like, oh, I hear people talk about grabbing pussies all the time, it's totally normal, like don't you hear that in locker rooms? And it's like, well, maybe some people are like that, maybe 20-year-old kind of footballers or whatever who drink when they're drunk say things like that, but I don't believe that Ben Carson is used to hearing that. It's quite funny.
So I think it brings us to political correctness and the backlash. A lot of this is backlash, and political correctness. I just think it's losing its way, because it's just become so absurd that I think that one of the funniest stories I heard was when there was a Twitter hashtag saying if men had periods, and they were all up in arms, all these feminists were all getting into it, and then suddenly transvestites said, well, men do have periods, and then it's just like everyone's just destroying everyone, because it's political correctness now means that you basically can't say anything. You've got to tiptoe around every conversation.
And what's interesting is that there's direct contradictions. There are people who say that gender is a social construct. And then there are people who are actually going through, a lot of people who are actually going through the transition are really, really offended by that. And there's a beginning to be within that community, the trans community, a bit of a war between people who think that there's no such thing, people that think it's kind of the be all and end all, who actually try and go into the extreme of actually transitioning. For example, broader example, there's different schools of feminism. So particularly there's a lot of pressure as a male to call yourself a feminist ally and agree with anything that's feminist. But there's contradictory points of view within feminism, so you can't agree with all of it.
So to kind of bring it to kind of relate it back into Donald Trump, though, I think the importance of this is that as much as I identify it's not come out of the vacuum, some of the things he's been saying and the attraction it's had to certain demographics, but equally that it is a product of kind of a kind of mutation and the kind of level of absurdity that political correctness operates with discursively. But also, as you said, where crucially is any of this actually going to impact upon policy in itself?
Exactly,
we've
got culture and politics have gone completely conflated. I think that's one of the things. It was Brexit was a culture war in a way, and certainly in American politics was a culture war. It was very little to do with policy, really. Well, at least in the media, but I think a lot. Actually, that was the point I was going to get into. My next point is a lot of Trump supporters, when they were interviewed, they were asked, what about all these things he said and blah blah. They said, I don't like him as a man. Like, why are you supporting? He's not Hillary. He's not going to export more jobs, etc. He's not going to.
Well, she wanted to.
He's not going to go. He's not going to declare war with Russia. Hillary Clinton literally said, "I am going to militarily react." She actually said, declared war in her campaign, which was the most reckless thing. More reckless than anything Donald Trump said.
And he gets painted as a warmonger.
Yeah.
When she's far worse in that department. And it's amazing how the media, even though we do know that they are in complete collusion with Clinton, it's amazing how the media can just overlook all of the terrible things that she's done as a Secretary of State.
I mean, so many progressives said, so Donald Trump's done all these things, created a fake university, all these, and he has done a lot of things that make you distrust him. And all Hillary did was use a wrong email address, like she used a Gmail instead of a Hotmail. And that's whereas the fact is that she perjured herself massively. She went against the court order and actually deleted emails that they asked for, which is contempt of court right there. And then there's so many other things with people using the State Department to get more money for the Clinton Foundation and wasting a lot of money that was meant to go to Haiti. Using a lot of money and getting deals for her brother before any of the relief actually reached anyone, and exploiting that disaster and so many other things.
Crisis capitalism.
It seems to be also kind of a routine of turning up in African countries or other kind of nations around the world and making speeches and then getting very kind of shady payments of kind of six-figure sums as well afterwards, particularly with Bill Clinton himself.
Multiple times his standard fee.
Indeed. And my particular favourite was that ridiculous routine in which she, back in the 90s when she was First Lady, and she flew into Bosnia-Herzegovina and claimed that she was under sniper fire as she flew in, and they had to kind of quickly run to armoured vehicles. When actually you watch the footage itself, and there's no such thing actually taking place as they leisurely kind of go from the plane and greet people and so forth. And so kind of delusional at best, if not criminal at worst. So things that haven't necessarily been kind of weighed up with kind of equal weight on each side. However, for example, today we've got a women's march, which is happening primarily in the USA, but there's kind of solidarity marches in London elsewhere, I think in Scotland as well. And as I say, the question that I keep want to ask is, what concretely has Donald Trump done unique to Mr. Trump as compared to policies that might be pursued by any kind of Republican candidate, which merits such either a feminist backlash or backlash from people who are saying that he's kind of a great threat to minorities or anyone else, in that where crucially is the actual policy, rather than just he seems to be a bit of a despicable character, an unsavoury character who shoots from the hip every now and then. Is Donald Trump actually, for example, the imitating of the disabled man in the audience? Obviously, absolutely
that
atrocious.
True, actually. I think that's been fairly debunked, and that's one of the things that the media lost credibility on. Just simply that the man in question, first of all, he doesn't move like that. He has an arm that doesn't move; it stays like that. And also, he has used that exact same impersonation many times. He used it for, I think, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, and lots of people. Basically, that was his go-to impression of someone realising they've been wrong. And the context was, it was something, a claim that he made. It was to do with Muslims in New Jersey celebrating on 9/11, and he said to the journalist, "You had it on your show. You showed it," and then he was like, "No, I didn't." And then they went back and they fact-checked, and it actually was there, and it was played on the television at the time, and the guy had forgotten.
I think my question would be,
Anyway,
even if it were the case that he was imitating a disabled person, what crucially is he going to do in office, or is proposed to do in office, that's going to kind of go after disabled people or go after people minorities?
He's going to build concentration camps, isn't he? Because he's literally Hitler, right?
Yeah, there are people who worry that we're going to be rounded up now, which is the fault of the sensationalist media. It's very, and that there was a really good point made. There was a video I saw of a black Trump supporter, and the journalist kept asking about these kind of these platitudes of, isn't he racist, blah blah blah. But he said, well, the president isn't in your mind. He's not. I don't want the president to be. That's thought policing. The president shouldn't be telling people whether to be racist or not. It's down to the individuals to think for themselves. So he said, what's he? Yeah, like you said, what's he actually going to do? And in fact, his economic policies, his controlling immigration, his planned infrastructure building, his cutting of corporation tax would be great for small businesses. I think I'll make this prediction now that black people will economically be much better off under Donald Trump than they were under Barack Obama.
I can see that.
The poverty rate of black people has increased very, very, very significantly under Barack Obama. They're economically much worse off than they were in 2008, and I think the reverse will happen under Donald Trump. He's bringing back the car industry to Detroit. He's doing all these things that maybe as economists we don't entirely agree with, but I think initially they won't be competing for jobs with illegal immigrants to the same extent. There'll be more jobs, more opportunities.
I think that's where perhaps, and it's good to know that there is a bit of disagreement in that. That's one of the things that actually is a prediction. I'm not sure. I wasn't sure about Clinton either in this respect, as to actually what the economic merits of Trump's policy suggestions are going to be. I'm very sceptical myself about the whole protectionist stuff. I think
so am I.
If there's anything that economists agree on around the world, that's that free trade is a good and beneficial thing for both kind of parties or all parties involved. So I would kind of divert there. However, I'm not completely convinced that there was any kind of great merits to any kind of Clinton remedy for the US economy if it was going to be more of the same with Barack Obama, what Barack Obama was doing.
Pseudo-socialism almost, isn't it?
Well, it's a statistic that stands out. We mentioned earlier when we were having a conversation about this was that labour force participation in America has dropped from somewhere around 70% to 60%, which that means 40% of people in the USA now of working age are no longer actually even working, officially registered as actually even looking for work. So they're either out of work or aren't even looking for it. So it's gone down to 60%. Comparison would be actually in the same time, our own labour force participation rate's gone up to 80%. So actually there's been a huge decline, as we've said, in the economic prospects of average Americans in America under Obama, and perhaps Clinton would be a continuation of that. However, I still think the way ahead is a bit cloudy as far as Trump's concerned.
And one thing I'll say to that is that I think that although I'm against protectionism, the US being such a huge country with such a diverse, big economy will be able to get away with it a bit more. They're used to kind of making their own things and doing having their own products and their own brands. And I do think that lowering corporation tax, especially, will outweigh, and also lowering some of the regulations, getting rid of some of the EPA regulations, which just destroyed the energy industry. I think the positives will outweigh the harm.
I would say that the
trade tariffs,
the economics, I think with Brexit and with Trump perhaps, people are less interested in the economics as they are with the culture, and it's a form of protecting the culture of Western values, which has played a huge role in these decisions. I think if we go to Brexit as well, that might be the next point we go to. I would say that both of these decisions are a way of us saying, well, actually, there's nothing wrong with us putting up borders and saying that these are the values we want to protect, we want to keep in our country.
So obviously the second huge thing that's happened in 2016 is a bit more domestic in that it's the United Kingdom has decided to leave, or voted to leave, the European Union and to sever our relationship with the European Union. And I personally have seen this as, or have kind of termed this, the nation state striking back, in that I think it's the only coherent way or perceptive way to understand quite what's happened here. Is nothing to do with, or not a tremendous amount to do with economics or defence or a number of other issues that the European Union is supposedly, we were told, was beneficial for, or kind of was important kind of in its interaction with. And actually it's more the United Kingdom, the people of the United Kingdom as a people saying, actually, we do not have any significant attachment to or feeling towards the community, this kind of artificial community, which is the European superstate. We don't, for states to be properly functioning, for them to be accepted and legitimate amongst the people they claim to represent or serve, it doesn't matter how much money or welfare they might dole out, in that some of the areas, I think it was in Wales, particular area that receives the highest amount of money per capita from the European Union, actually voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union, and people couldn't quite understand this. And key to understanding that is that it doesn't matter really what kind of material benefits you give out if people don't actually believe you to be legitimate, if people don't think of themselves as European citizens ahead of being British citizens or Welsh citizens, then the whole thing is kind of a set of branches without a trunk to kind of to weld them together. It's a flag and a national anthem that people don't quite believe in, and if we don't understand that and accept that, even though we might want Europeans to kind of morph into kind of homogenous kind of creatures that are all the same, that perhaps that might be wonderful, in that it might be nice to have such an integration of European peoples. Actually, if it's not going to happen and it's clearly not reality, there's no point, and it's actually quite destructive and harmful to pursue European integration if indeed that is not the case.
Yeah, I think if you weld the countries together, it's always going to it's going to make it much easier to blame other countries for your problems. It's like if you force people to live with each other, they're more likely to argue than if they don't live with each other, and they just see each other when they want to. And I think that what I think is a fallacy, or what I think is just strange, or maybe another way kind of proving the more ardent anti-Europeans right, is this idea that Britain mustn't be allowed to be better off outside the EU, otherwise countries will seek to look for their own arrangements and they'll be better off. Angela Merkel actually said countries mustn't be allowed to be better off outside the EU than within. Wow. So God forbid that countries would actually find a new arrangement that makes them better off, and that people live there better off. Das ist verboten. Like it kind of proves this idea that the European Union does actually pursue its own power and isn't just acting as it claims to, doesn't just act in interest of the member states.
But that was something that Daniel Hannan was actually saying throughout the referendum. He was saying that everyone's fearing, we don't know how it's going to materialise at the moment, but everyone's fearing this kind of punishment that we're going to receive from the European Union as a warning to any other state that might want to leave the European Union. Even if that is the case, that the European Union is going to kind of be so spiteful to damage itself economically, and it's not in great economic shape. You don't kind of think most people have kind of picked up on that. Even if it's going to be as insane as to do that, the corollary of that, or the follow-up, is to say, actually, in order to avoid that, you're going to marry yourself to, even kind of have a closer relationship with this group of people who are clearly malevolent, spiteful and insane, and you're going to wed yourself to them in the long term in order to kind of avoid a short-term kind of backlash. The whole thing is kind of Stockholm syndrome writ large. It's more kind of Brussels syndrome instead. And it's just, it doesn't seem to work out on its own logic. It doesn't stand on its own 2 feet, which is kind of going back to that thing I was saying earlier about being a load of branches without a trunk. Most arguments to do with the European Union in defence of it, especially from British commentators who aren't Europhiles in the truest sense, in that you very rarely heard during the referendum people defending the European Union on its own terms, of saying, isn't it brilliant that we're having the formation of an ever closer union, of a superstate, of a union politically of the countries of Europe. Instead, there was this kind of half-hearted, half kind of semi-baked idea of, well, we get a few benefits here and there, it's not perfect, but perhaps we can do a bit of free trade, perhaps we can do a bit of this or that, or there's kind of a European arrest warrant, or a load of things that you can get advantages from, or you could kind of arrangements that could work without having to be one political state, or have that as your ultimate kind of destination. However, as I say, not actually making an argument that is kind of coherent and fundamental to kind of the first principles of this.
And there are so many straw men. There was this assumption that if we leave the EU, we're going to have to not do things that we want to do. Like, for example, people said, well, there won't be, if we don't have enough immigration, then we won't have enough people to work in the NHS. We're not going to be in a position where we're not allowed to let nurses into the country. We can let people that we want in. Yeah. We can do have as much of a relationship as we want with Europe, because it's a mutually beneficial.
Yeah, well, a lot of people have spoken about the Australian system, points-based system, where people who are genuinely going to benefit the country will be let in. And like you said, a nurse who wants to come to the UK, if we need nurses, and we say, right, we're going to allow a certain number of nurses in, based on that system, you're gonna be able to fill that quota and whatever's needed.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's kind of it's a false dichotomy then, that this idea that if you don't have complete open door immigration to the EU, then you're going to have a completely closed door policy to anyone who might want to come into the country, beneficial or otherwise. However, going back to this idea of the nation state and legitimacy, I think it's really important that no matter what your opinions might be on how we should run an immigration policy, this immigration policy will be in the hands of a British government, and the hands of the British government won't be tied by the European conventions that you have to have an open door to all European citizens. And I think we might be able to. I think the United Kingdom has been kind of tortured by its by this debate on immigration, by the unease, the feeling that we're not quite in control of our own borders, and actually we'll be able to hopefully get a bit closer to being kind of at peace with ourselves on this. If, as I say, no matter what policy is chosen, people can see it as being legitimate because it's been chosen by the British people ourselves rather than by Brussels. And as I say, I think it's one of those fundamental issues of essence of the nation state, rather than necessarily the kind of more superficial or cosmetic pieces of policy as to how we actually decide to conduct ourselves. The point is we need to actually, people are only comfortable or feel it's legitimate if indeed we are the people making the decisions, no matter what decisions actually are made.
Yeah, you can be in favour of a liberal immigration policy and be quite, but still maybe think that we should be in control of that policy, almost as a matter of principle.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the debate was focused on, going back to the political correctness, what we talked about earlier, just labelling anyone who wants this return to sovereignty as a racist, and it's just such a lame argument that's used against Trump. It's been used in Brexit, and it's just a lame argument. You can be a complete non-racist and just want the power to be brought back, immigration to be reduced. I think one of the things that brought the Conservatives in was their desire to bring hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands. That's what the British people voted for, as well as being allowed to have a referendum. When we were given the referendum, we voted for Brexit, and it just doesn't automatically make you a racist. And a lot of the movement, I think this is one of the things that actually trick the polls, is the virtue signalling that goes on with people who are saying, well, yeah, I'm anti-Brexit because it's just xenophobic, but it's not xenophobic. No. If you look at it in terms of the political compass, Brussels and the EU is to the left and to the authoritarian side. It's basically going for a lot of control over. Brexit is actually going to the right and down into the libertarian side for me, because it's making the power of that government smaller, because it's not just a European government, it's a nation government, and this is the direction I think we're seeing people shift to the right across the world, and
more the kind of classical liberal right, I think, in many ways, and also that there's such an irony so a lot of people in favour of having the same immigration policy for everybody, no matter what country you're from, and that was one of the main points made by the Leave campaign. And the idea that you're in favour of treating someone from another continent the same as white Western Europeans, you're on that side of the table as opposed to the other side of the table that want to give those people special treatment. The idea that you're suddenly the racist, and also and the idea of a super state being run by Germany and being against that somehow makes you a fascist as well. It's kind of silly.
And kind of points related to this, which I think is important to raise, is just as I completely agree that to be pro-Brexit, as 52% of the electorate were, or of those who voted were, clearly does not make you a racist, and we don't have that many kind of racists in the country. However, actually, even if we are to accept that some of the voters, and I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it, actually do hold kind of what we'd call racist, or we might call it kind of more of a soft racist kind of approach, in the sense of they're not the kind of people who are going to kind of, even if they are racist, they're not going to pursue that racism in a violent or kind of political manner in order to persecute minorities or anyone else. However, even if that is the case, and we had that Channel 4 interviewed that guy after the vote, shortly after the vote, and they said, "Sir, why did you vote for to leave the European Union?" And he said, "Well, it's to stop the fucking Muslims, isn't it?" And I think it was that shocking, you were almost confused rather than kind of outraged at the logic in this poor man's head. However, let's just say that the whole of the north of England is full of people like that, or the south of England for that matter as well, and the Midlands. if that is the case, we can do one of two things. We can either be disgusted at it and ignore it and say, right, even though we've got a completely racist and xenophobic population, we're going to steam straight ahead with open door immigration. We're going to try and kind of ride roughshod over this. Or perhaps we're that disgusted with people like this, we should try and kind of politically re-educate them and kind of outlaw their particular views, all so many million of them. So you can take this quite kind of extreme confrontational approach. Or perhaps you could say, it's not ideal that we have these levels of xenophobia. It's not ideal that we have this kind of racism in amongst the population. It's as soft as to say. It's that caveat of saying it's kind of a soft racism rather than an extreme or violent racism.
People prefer to be around people who are like them, kind of thing.
Indeed.
Than,
And you can take the confrontational approach, which I think is very misguided and is never going to kind of lead to a backlash. That is the road to kind of stirring up a true kind of fascist kind of racist politics. Or you could take the more conservative, accommodating approach, which is to say this might not be ideal, however it is the case. And for that reason, actually, we're going to try and respect these people's feelings as much as possible, because agitating them, confronting them, trying to change them or kind of fit this kind of round peg into a square hole isn't actually going to work.
But it'll make them. I think it'll make people a lot more moderate who are like that. I do think it's a tiny minority of people, but I think that a lot of people. I even met people and spoke to people who literally say I'm a racist, and then I go why, and then the reasons they give are just basically the government should put British people first. Immigration, the British tradition should go first, and just kind of normal mainstream kind of ideas. But if you go with this extreme, like you must be in favour of complete open borders, or you're extreme, then people will go, well, I'm extreme then, and then they'll join the EDL because they think, well, that's me then.
Well, I don't know if it necessarily drives people that far,
but not necessarily that far, but at least further.
Yeah.
I think there's also another false dichotomy as well, which is particularly highlighted by the Nigel Farage when he was stood in front of that campaign poster saying breaking point with the immigrants crossing, or the migrants crossing the Syrian border. Is this false dichotomy between the idea that there's been this unhelpful linking or fusing or confusion of the idea that if you're not in favour of giving citizenship out to people from war zones from across the world, just as long as they can reach the shores of Europe or the United Kingdom, you automatically become a citizen, you automatically kind of ascend to a place in British society and become a member of the British population, that you don't desire that doesn't mean that you are against the idea that Britain has moral responsibilities to provide aid to people from these war zones, to perhaps even provide temporary accommodation or protection, and to be allowed into the United Kingdom or Europe in order to kind of see out the conflict in their own countries, and then hopefully with a view to kind of returning. That because you've had aid and immigration and citizenship kind of linked together artificially, people look at that poster and see Nigel Farage stood in front of it, and they see it as necessarily a complete and outright attack on the people, the poor people in that particular photo who are leaving Syria or a war zone, and actually thinking that kind of Nigel Farage wants to kind of like do harm to these people purely because he doesn't wish to extend citizenship to them, whereas actually the United Kingdom is in the forefront of the aid effort which is going on in Syria. And they say there's an unfortunate and unnecessary confusion of the two.
And there's also the issue of encouraging people to go out into the Atlantic and to the Mediterranean, and so if you actually reward people for it by giving them asylum if they get here, that's why they did it in Greece, but now people are coming through to Sicily and they're not doing the same. They haven't got the same arrangements with Libya that they had with Turkey, but it sounds very harsh, but if they disincentivize people to make the dangerous voyage by saying, well, if you come to Europe, we're going to put you at the back of the queue, not the front of the queue, which might be very harsh on some individuals, but overall a lot less people will die. And there's also the obvious point that there's something like there are around 40 million, I think it might even be more than that, refugees in the world, far more than we can.
Oh yeah.
So we can accommodate. So it's only going. So this idea of just solving the problem by migration is very silly.
It's not just that, because it's, first of all, if you look at the statistics, I think about 60% of these migrants are economic migrants, 80% are males. So if you just look at those raw statistics aren't racist for starters, but if you look at the statistics, that's showing you that, firstly, if they're going to rebuild their country, if they need to have their fighting men on board to defeat whoever it is that's oppressing them, ISIS or whoever. Secondly, they're going to need, these people who are leaving are taking an initiative. If they don't have those type of initiative taking people in their country to rebuild a nation afterwards, again, we're just sucking out their best people. So it's like people can't see there's two sides to this argument that okay, if they are the qualified people that you say they are and they should be allowed in our society, then what is their society going to become? How they're always going to be dependent on us for aid and for certain things like this.
But, their own countries are going to be disproportionately women, children, and old people.
Yeah.
The main brute force of the workforce is going to be disappeared. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
We also have another confusion, which is you're saying about this whole idea of the torturous journey to get from, say, North Africa into Europe by crossing the Mediterranean in a raft, and kind of I think it was only the other day that about 100 migrants died in making this treacherous journey. That we should do, you kind of need to do one of two things, or it makes moral sense, or it's logical to do one of two things. One of them is to pursue the option you've put on the table there, which is to say, actually, we're going to completely disincentivize people and say that the navies of Europe will stop people crossing, make sure they're safe, but turn them around and take them back to their points of origin. Or, if that's not the case, then, and we're happy with the idea of linking aid with citizenship and kind of abolishing all of the values of kind of having a nation state and having citizenship being something a privilege rather than a right that can be doled out to the whole of the world, to whoever kind of wants to become British or any of the other European nationalities. If we're kind of going to turn ourselves into a branch or a wing of the United Nations, then actually we should be kind of ferrying these people across. That it would make its absolute logic and moral sense that actually the navies of Europe actually should be putting on regular kind of ferries between North Africa or Syria and our own countries or continent, because, like I say, that would be in line with that particular policy of complete acceptance, or we pursue the opposite policy, but actually we're pursuing something in the middle, a confused and kind of ill thought out policy, if it's been thought out at all, which is just simply say, well, if you can risk the journey and if you can kind of jaunt it across and perhaps kind of risk your life in the process, then we'll reward you at the end with citizenship. And it's a madness which has occurred once again through not kind of looking at the basic kind of logic and the first principles of how we kind of stand with relation to the outside world.
Another thing that I feel with the immigration situation is that there are two things that just don't mix. It's having a welfare state and having free immigration. You can't have both and make it sustainable. So Germany, for example, has 1.5 million immigrants, supposedly Syrian, but as we've discussed, 60% are economic migrants, 80% are males. So I would say there is definitely a portion of people who are true refugees who need the best treatment possible. But there is certainly another group of people who are economic migrants and other things. But from that 1.5 million people, so far only 34,000 are in work. So that means that there is a huge strain on the German economy, and you just can't. The two things just can't mix, because you just can't have an open door policy and expect with in combination with a welfare state. They just don't function together.
I think there's truth in that point. As you say, the statistics about you can't just transition people who don't speak the language of that country into the workplace, even if they do have the skills to be able to perform jobs that are needed. However, I think actually, as much as it might not be economically sustainable, I think actually more important than the economic, even if it was economically sustainable, would be that it's not culturally sustainable. Because to have a welfare state and open door immigration, because actually it doesn't matter a great deal, in my own opinion, what is actually kind of what the economic, what proportion of the resources of the country which are being diverted to migrants. And I think it's very much overblown in that I've got friends who are quite intelligent, older kind of people who believe that their kind of pension policies or their kind of retirement is actually actively now being affected by migrant strains on the economy, which are quite outlandish and kind of wild assertions to make, even though I agree with this idea that that there definitely is a strain with the current economic, with the current migrant crisis. However, it's more people's perceptions seem to be much more important than actual underlying economic realities, because once again, it doesn't matter how big the resources are or how generous. If people do not necessarily identify these people who the resources are going to as being kind of legitimately part of that nation state or that community, then inevitably, no matter what the reality is, you're going to have a lack of an erosion of legitimacy in the system. Welfare states are built upon kind of an agreement or a social capital of acceptance and agreement and kind of friendship or solidarity or fraternity between peoples who regard themselves to be of the same kind of identity in the national sense. And as soon as you start playing with that and disrupting that, the underlying promise and agreement or kind of covenant between the peoples of a nation breaks down, and you have a lot of illegitimacy and all of the political consequences of that. So I think, to say, there's an economic point, but there's also a cultural point there as well.
And I think that the thing that works well with America, and it was certainly, this is beginning to be under threat as well, is that they have this melting pot kind of metaphor, if you like, of how you become American first, and everything else is secondary. You still can bring it with you. You still can be Italian American or African American, but the culture was based on assimilating and becoming one with the American culture. In Europe, we don't have that as strongly, and I think it's partly, you can partly blame the European culture, but you can also, some cultures also just don't want to integrate either. And until we can somehow fix this situation, whether it means better screening or however you do that, there needs to be some level of... So if you take the American, for example, the way the American system is, and I've had family who've gone through this, it's a 10-year process for the official immigration thing, where you have to go through all kinds of tests. And by the time Cialdini, he's a writer on influence and how influence works, he talks about how the reason why, like, say, fraternity groups in America or whatever, they have these crazy initiation ceremonies that you have to go through. I think maybe in Oxford as well they do that. Oh yeah, Piggate, of course. But these initiation ceremonies, by going through all of this, you then, because you've gone through this huge hurdle to get there, you really feel one with that nation or whatever it is, whatever group you're joining. And so that 10-year American thing that most immigrants have to go through, they're going to feel fully American and they're going to be at one with America. A lot of them are. But if you remove that and you just say, right, boom, you're in, you're going to lose a lot of the incentives to create and it doesn't have to be assimilation. You don't have to lose your own culture. You just need to be able to accept the new culture and perhaps, if you want, maintain your old culture. And that integration is the key. If you can get both, that's wonderful. You get to eat your curry and you get to be British and respect freedom of speech or whatever it is that you want to do.
I think with the current... actually, before we go into that, just to address some of the economic points, it's important to acknowledge that that migrants do overall contribute a lot more than they take, and that actually, especially European migrants in particular, they actually, even compared to British-born people, they actually earn more, pay more taxes, and a smaller percentage of them take benefits. But that's in itself is indicative of a problem of a lack of labour participation rate among the kind of native British population, for want of a better word, and how actually a lot of employers look to employ migrants because they know they're here to work. And there's a bit of a kind of kind of reverse stereotype that I think a lot of middle class British people have of working class British people, that they're lazy and that they won't do the job properly and they'd rather employ. No one's talking about this, but I think a lot of employers would rather. And there's certain companies, certain places you go where they just clearly do not employ British people, full stop. They'd much rather have European people, particularly European people, but other, and then this is all speculation, but I get those. If you go into the more kind of solid ideas, is that if you have an almost unlimited supply of labour, simple supply and demand, there's never going to be any pressure on employers to raise wages. And there's also going to be a massive demand push, a lot more people looking for apartments, rents are going to go up, a lot more people shopping.
It's not surprising that the elite
going up.
want mass immigration because they benefit hugely.
Yeah, it does enforce the class system to a great extent, I think. Yeah.
But we're even, for example, the solution, for example, if we're talking about overcrowding, we're talking about lack of housing stock, the solution obviously would be to build more houses. Solutions, there are kind of ways in which you could quite creatively integrate migrants with a community. However, that being the case, we seem to be phenomenally bad at it, and we've got a terrible track record. And even though we've got this terrible track record, we seem to kind of ignore this. And I'm not just talking about the British nation, I'm talking about the European Union in general. There was a good programme about the situation in Sweden. Sweden has accepted quite a large number of migrants from Syria and elsewhere. And
2% of their population.
It wouldn't surprise me if it is that high. And especially if you look at the German rate, that the Germans are going to increase their population by 1% each year if they take in 800,000 migrants, as Frau Merkel seems to think is possible. However, say even in the kind of, we think of Sweden as being this kind of social democratic paradise, actually it's been phenomenally bad in the way in which it's actually formed kind of ghettos around the main cities in Malmö and in Gothenburg and Stockholm, in which you've got, as I say, communities of Arabic migrants who feel, unsurprisingly, completely disenfranchised, completely disassociated with and alienated from the home country, even in a country, as I say, as kind of social democratically advanced and brilliant as Sweden supposedly is. And it's actually borne out in the fact that Sweden per capita has, I believe, has produced more jihadists who have gone to join ISIS than any other country in the European Union. And that is at the top, that's kind of the tip of the iceberg of a huge amount of dissatisfaction, which is clearly manifesting itself in Sweden and elsewhere. So even if there are ideal solutions for these kind of problems about integration, there's no reason to believe that we're not going to be equally as sluggish and terrible as our track record suggests that we have been already.
And we have such a shortage of housing that we need. I think that there needs to be a period of quite tightly controlling the numbers, and in order to catch up with the deficit. So if we build hundreds of thousands of houses, but if we're letting in that same number of people, then all we're doing is just treading water. We're not actually making any progress as well. So I think, So if we really want a country where the standard of living is going up and the cost of housing is going down, the cost of living is going down, and wages are going up in real term, not just contributing to inflation with monetary policy, etc. Then I think you need a combination of having as free a market as possible, but with but controlling the the country demographically to a certain extent as
And
well.
one more thing that we haven't mentioned, which is another spectre that seems to stalk the migrant crisis, is something that we've talked about in the kind of other videos that we filmed, which is the completely unnecessary wave of terrorist attacks that have occurred, which I think it's important to say, and not to sensationalise it, to say that the vast majority, 99.9% of migrants that have come from Syria and elsewhere into Europe have not and will not commit or conduct terrorist actions or collude in them. However, even if it is 0.1%, because we've been insistent on linking citizenship with aid, these attacks need not ever have occurred. And once again, if we're to talk about, even if we're to identify what the realities are ourselves by saying indeed it is 0.1%, if not less, that are actually committing these offences and these atrocities, actually it doesn't really matter in the sense of what the cultural reaction is going to be. In that we mentioned that man up north who says he doesn't want the Muslims to come into his country. As despicable and as kind of close-minded as that is, as we've mentioned before, what do we do with that individual? Do we kind of confront him and re-educate him and trying to kind of beat him into this kind of mould of what we think the politically correct citizen is? Or do we perhaps try and take the conservative option of trying to accommodate our political policies around not kind of aggravating and not kind of respecting his legitimacy as a sovereign citizen in this country?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's only a very small percentage, and it'd be a shame. It's a difficult decision as a humanitarian. Is it worth having one or two terrorist attacks in order to save maybe 100,000 people? We'll give them there is an argument. I think some people would say that it's a problem, but it's kind of the positives outweigh the negatives.
But is saving them necessarily
Exactly.
the same as kind of giving
Yeah,
citizenship?
I was going, as we've said before, this is a fallacious idea anyway, but I'm just saying from many people's points of view. There is a really strong aversion to facts, especially when they're considered to be, but it might increase xenophobia, etc. Obviously, but suppressing them makes it worse. Like, for example, Europol said that they estimated that there are around 7,000 people who fought for ISIS who are already in Europe, who have already come through, already come back. 7,000 ISIS fighters, and that's not. This is not something we've taken from some kind of conspiracy theorist website. It's Europol, the most kind of the intelligence agency for Europe, but that's been swept aside. And
I think going back to the idea of Brexit as well, it's we're here, governments are here to protect us as a nation. It's not our role to be involved in every single situation that's going on in the world. So how come some of the other countries, like I think the Middle Eastern countries, are taking in zero migrants?
That's the big elephant in the room. Is countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, who take people from countries like India, and they have a massive, almost slave migrant force. Why aren't they? Why aren't countries where they have more culturally in common? Why are they not taking anybody?
And it just takes one family to be torn apart by a terrorist attack, and as we've seen through last year, there've been countless attacks, which it's a trend that's at its big. With the amount of migrants that have come in, like you said, even if it's 0.1%, that is not. We can't just judge it on last year's terrorist attacks. This is something that we're going to be taking in for year after year after year, because this is what. Unfortunately, with the nature of radical Islam, this is what we're taking in to our nations, and naturally, I think people are going to be concerned about it, and whether they thought their vote for Brexit will help in this situation, or their vote for Trump will help in this situation. This is a way of saying no to the government elite, and the government and the elite.
It's like the emergency stop button on the treadmill.
It's a way of
kind of.
It's a way of saying no more, and it's not. It just takes one family to be. Is Merkel going to visit the families of the people whose families been torn apart by the attacks that have happened as a result of her?
And it's more than just the numbers of people that died. A lot of what you see, a lot of arguments being made, a lot of YouTube videos saying, well, this many people die falling off ladders and these kind of things. People die crossing the road, but it's not a threat to your way of life. You know, going about your everyday life that you need to look both ways before you cross the road. These are normal risks. But the idea of New Year celebrations being cancelled, Christmas markets being cancelled because you could get violently, brutally murdered. Is a different kettle of fish altogether, and it affects the way of life a lot more.
Yeah, the exact detail. If you go to the exact details of what happened at Bataclan, some of those,
absolutely,
is brutal, and
brutal.
It's just it's the worst horror film that you can imagine actually happening to our own citizens, and
it's all right. Carry on. Carry on talking.
Have you got a mute button on that?
Yeah, I need to switch it off. But carry on.
Should we just...
This is like a podcast. We can have imperfections.
So we'll just get to the last point. So what was the last point?
Well, I was just going to very quickly say that I think also there's another responsibility, which is the need, kind of the moral responsibility to protect the minorities that we already have within Europe. In that we talked a lot about, and quite rightly, about the violence that's been done.
Let's just reset that one.
Sure. Having quite rightly discussed the terrorist atrocities that have been committed by radical Islam itself in the European Union or in the countries of Europe, partly as a result of the migration crisis and the kind of liberal immigration policies that have been put in place, especially in Germany and France. I think it's also important to say that there's a moral responsibility perhaps to the minorities that we have within our European countries at the moment anyway, who, and it's not covered as much as it should be, are actually now receiving attacks once again from the xenophobic and racist parts of the population, of the native population in this country, but more so in France and elsewhere, and also in Eastern Europe. Do we not kind of owe a moral responsibility to the people already here to say that we won't kind of let the situation become aggravated to the point at which we're also kind of stoking up or asking for and provoking this type of very vicious and malignant, malign, kind of racist white backlash against minorities that's inevitably actually going to be the case with such kind of immigration policies that kind of just seem to say we're going to ignore all kind of
dissent,
all not dissent as much, but just the reality of kind of whatever inherent racism or xenophobia there might well be in the country, and say that we're going to try and kind of, as I said, devalue and abolish the idea of citizenship as it otherwise historically is meant, and say actually we're going to kind of weld people together and force people into the same country and move them into the same kind of community with each other, without fully appreciating that there's going to be violence which is going to occur from both sides, which is going to be kind of equally awful in its kind of moral standing, yet is perfectly kind of predictable outcome of this immigration policy. So there seems to be actually responsibility, to say, to the migrants themselves as well as to the native populations as well. However, something else we wanted to get onto was predictions for the future, because I think if 2016 has been quite a tumultuous year, then 2017 is going to be quite so as well. So what, Tom, have you got any particular predictions for 2017?
I mean, one thing it would be from a Brexit point of view, one thing would be interesting is if we're able to start securing, and maybe this will go going beyond 2017. But if Donald Trump is going to be very protectionist, like you said, against many parts of the world, but he's going to do a free trade deal with us, and we're going to do lots of free trade deals with lots of parts of the world and continue to have a good relationship with the European market, that could be very very good for Britain. It could really make us the square in the centre of the chessboard of the world economically, and really make us the keystone that connects up all these different markets, and important for every multinational corporation will need to put themselves here in order to access America and all the emerging markets around the world and Europe. So it's having someone who's an Anglophile in the White House could, and someone who maybe doesn't pursue the best trade relationship with the rest of the world, which we don't agree with, I think we can all say, but we could really benefit from that, I think.
So the bust of Winston Churchill has actually returned to the Oval Office, which was a huge kind of signal, as subtle as it was. So actually, kind of a refreshingly positive outlook on the economic situation that Brexit's going to bring. That perhaps actually we can kind of go out there and make trade deals of our own accord. That we're going to be at the front of the queue rather than the back of it. That we've already had the Australians and New Zealanders and the Canadians as well saying that they've got a high priority on the idea of getting a trade deal in place, as well as places outside the Commonwealth. As I understand, the South Koreans are very interested in resuming kind of free trade relations with the United Kingdom in a post European world. So kind of refreshingly positive compared to a lot of the kind of very negative and almost kind of willingly negative outlooks that we've seen.
Very willingly negative. Also, of course, we have a trade. One of the fallacies that, like we were talking about earlier, is that we actually have a trade deficit with Europe. Putting a tariff will actually hurt Europe a lot more. I think John Wedgwood put it quite well. He said, well, why are we talking about how much we have to pay to access the single market of Europe? Surely, as there's a trade deficit, we should be talking about how much Europe has to pay to access the British market, kind of thing. Slightly facetious, but actually valid point. So, yeah, on trade, I think all these things are actually some things we should be positive about. And also going on about the willingly negativeness, it was really the media reaction to Brexit was just horrible. Especially that idea of just having that drunk 15-year-old, who literally underage drinking 15-year-old talking on a bus and someone filming it, and that being pushed all around the world saying this is what Britain is now. As if his views are somehow indicative of the whole country.
I didn't see that video.
And kind of indicative of people that actually have cultural influence and power. It's just so absurd.
Yeah, and did you have any kind of
I think
predictions?
I think one of the big themes of last year was the left eating the left, and I think the left will almost completely eat the left in this year, because
you think they'll double down on it
the desire to find some particular thing that you can get on a high horse about, whether it's transgender or Islam or feminism or whatever it is, that there are so many things that are in complete conflict with each other. Like I said earlier, with the if men had periods was all about feminism, and then the transgender community jumped on that and they started having this infighting. I think this infighting is just going to happen between all kinds of different things, and I think it's going to be quite entertaining. And it's going to get a lot worse.
The fire's going to keep burning.
Well,
I'm not sure.
I think a really important event with regard to that is actually going to be the by-elections that are going to take place very soon in Tristram Hunt's district or constituency in Stoke, but also I believe there's one elsewhere taking place on the same day, in which I think if Labour lose those seats, whether it be to the Conservatives, but more importantly, if it's to UKIP, I think we're going to see a definite kind of another fork in the road between the Parliamentary Labour Party and the more moderate kind of new Labour types and Jeremy Corbyn's much more extreme hard left style of Labour politics,
aka communism.
Well, if
it's
indeed,
it's a cocktail, it's a bandwagon, it's
Okay.
hardcore environmentalism, identity politics, and anti-capitalism, I think, because I'm not sure it's communism, because if you ask them if they support communism, say no, but it's more anti any kind of economic idea.
I think the main important strategic point is electorally for them is if they can start to see occurring in the north of England and in the Midlands what has happened to Labour in Scotland, i.e. you've got the Scottish National Party bringing a kind of identity politics, being a nationalist party, as well as being wrapped up in kind of a far left kind of, or if not far left, but kind of vibrating to the far left style of policies, that if they start seeing that happen with kind of a semi-protest movement in UKIP in the north of England and in the Midlands, then I think the Parliamentary Labour Party is going to fear for its actual kind of entire existence. And it could be kind of the crack in the dam.
Some Labour MPs have said that. I think most of the moderate Labour MPs really get this. I think actually it's only in the UK. I think people since Brexit, people have tried to. Most people, not everyone, but have tried to change the conversation, actually getting away from these kind of regressive, ironically called progressive kind of idioms. But in America, it seems to be. I see no hope. I think the more. It just seems to be more and more. The more happens, the more people double down on. More than half the country.
You mean within the left? Because I see a lot of hope in America. To be honest.
I mean, possibly.
Yeah.
But
I think that group is going to get more.
The MSNBC.
Yeah.
Rachel Maddow, actually during her commentary during the Trump speech, he said because he said America first, which is an incredibly kind of broad, obvious thing to say that almost any American politician would say, because they have a more nationalistic culture, and literally every American politician I'm sure has said that. But because he said America first, she said that in the 1930s there was a group that called themselves America First, and some of them like the Nazis, and then she said Trump was invoking the Nazis. That's literally what she said during her commentary on the television. It was but we will see on that front. But I think most of the moderate Labour MPs understand it. I think something will happen between now and 2020. Whether it's Jeremy Corbyn finally realising that he's not going to get anywhere in the polls and stepping down, or whether it's...
I don't think he'll step down, because I think he's really entrenched in the struggle.
Yeah.
I think obviously the interesting things will happen in Europe as well. There are all these elections coming up. I still think the collective guilt that Germany feels for their National Socialists will still ensure Merkel wins. But I have a feeling that #I'm with her, Marine Le Pen will win the French elections, and it's gonna. I think Holland's going to be interesting too.
Yeah, I think personally, I have a feeling, although I don't follow French politics, I have a feeling that that Francois Fillon will steal the thunder, and he'll emerge. But we'll see.
One last prediction I'd like to put on the table as well. It might be kind of a bit radical and kind of the kind of audacity of hope. Is that with Donald Trump in the White House and with a more isolationist US foreign policy, we'll see a withdrawal of US support to the Syrian rebels. And also perhaps a quiet kind of sacrifice of the eastern Ukraine as well. And perhaps, and I say it is a hope, because there are a lot of other moving parts when you've got the Turks and the Arabs as well involved in that conflict and heavy kind of backers of the Syrian rebels. And you don't need to be a particular fan of the odious and kind of the completely criminal, I kind of run out of superlatives to describe the Assad regime. However, I think actually that country needs a lot less attention from the outside world, and that perhaps Donald Trump being in the White House could be an important move to see a withdrawal of US support to those factions and perhaps a quietening down of that conflict. However, as I say, that is it's a hope, and it depends on lots of other kind of moving parts in the region rather than just the Americans. But actually, I think there is a lot more hope to be seen in a Trump presidency as far as foreign policy is concerned, compared to a prospective kind of Clinton presidency that we might have had. We've been seeing kind of no-fly zones over Syria and other types of kind of further kind of entanglement of US foreign policy in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to raise. I think you're right. I think that having a more cooperative relationship with Putin, there's a possibility that what might happen is once stability is over and the war is over, there might be a quiet moving, especially with the amount of influence Putin has, of actually just taking Assad away and replacing him with someone else. Who might be a little bit more moderate, or at least someone, he's not the very guy that's been killing people, so at least make some of the Syrian people feel a bit better. I think I agree that the escalation of the war, the problems with Russia, are slightly absurd. Especially there are far more dangerous governments, like the Iranian government. They've literally said that they want to bring about the end of the world so the 12th Imam can appear.
Oh yeah.
But Obama's been dealing with the Iranian government as if they're like a special relationship almost, almost trusting them more than sort of allies like Israel.
I think one of the things that's most absurd, and I find it quite fascinating, is the way that Russia's suddenly the big enemy of the left, because it really reminds me of 1984, when it's like we're at war with, I can't remember which way around it was, but we're at war with East Asia. No, I thought we were at war with Eurasia, and it's like no, we're at war with East Asia. We always have been, and it's like suddenly Russia, which was the Soviets were the great allies of the left. Suddenly now they're blame America. If you can't blame America, blame Russia. It seems to be like
I think there's an element of cultural Marxism, because Russians are still essentially seen as being white and powerful as a nation, and I think that there's a double standard. Like the reason why people are much more outraged about the fact that LGBT community there was a kind of ban on them being portrayed overly in the media.
But now that they're allies with America, they suddenly become the bad guy, and it's a sudden switch.
So the outrage was there was that huge amount of outrage there, but very little when it comes to Muslims throwing homosexuals off the top of buildings. That's just cultural relativism. That's just a different culture. You have to respect their culture. So just following on from my point about Iran, there's also the issue that I think you guys have touched on as well, of arming the rebels. And not only have they been arming the rebels, they've been arming groups that are officially called this the moderate opposition, but have sworn allegiance to al-Nusra, which is just Al-Qaeda in Syria.
Okay.
And even in the WikiLeaks emails, one of the things that emerged was actually that Hillary Clinton and John Kerry were funneling arms to people, and they knew that some of it was ending up with ISIS, and they were continuing to go with the same channel. So they were literally arming ISIS, which is just a madness. And it's really quite astounding. Well, a lot of people on the progressive side don't know about this, but a lot of people on the conservative side of in America, this actually are a little bit more wary of this. And there's a guy I know that I have connection with on Twitter who's a retired colonel, so really top brass guy, not just someone living in the middle of nowhere who doesn't know anything, but someone who's sort of at the top of the American military who actually believes that Obama is part of ISIS.
Oh yeah.
And he was, and he's constantly tweeting. This is someone who actually fought for America and was commanding armies, who's retired before Obama was sworn in, but who actually thinks that's really the commander-in-chief is literally on the side of the terrorists. It's just absolutely astounding.
On that bombshell then, I feel it's probably time to kind of wrap up the conversation we've been having. Please do go ahead and subscribe to our channel. We've got lots of other videos coming out in 2017, which, as we've predicted, is going to be quite an exciting year politically. Our channel and our website is perspective.tv, and we've also got Tom's blog, which is Blurbme at what's the full title?
It's at Blurbme Liberty. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter, but all the links are below. I have a WordPress blog, which lots of articles are kind of queued, going to come out. My name's Tom Fletcher. So
Thanks for coming, Tom.
Yeah, and hopefully there will be some more collaborations as well to come.
Right.